Hi, I'm Warren Mayor Jim Fouts. Welcome to another Fouts Forum. Today we're going to talk about senior scams, and our guest today is, to my right, is Sergeant Matthew Nichols of the Administrative Service Bureau in the Warren Police Department, whose main responsibility is to prevent and investigate senior scams in Warren. Now, his background is as follows. He is a graduate of Macomb Community College and Madonna University. He has 18 years of law enforcement experience. He is an expert in transient criminals and non-traditional organized crime. He's been involved in countless investigations in the U.S. The result is successful prosecutions, recovery of stolen property, and restitution. He's developed and presented training programs on transient crime. He serves on the Board of Admissions for National Association of Bunco Investigations, and he's been interviewed by Time Magazine and the author of articles on transient crime. Clearly, Mr. Nichols is a very important part of the Warren Police Department. Now, just to give you an overview before I do some questions, I am particularly interested in this because as your mayor, I often get calls from seniors and from children of seniors who are concerned about the fact that their mother or father or their grandmother or grandfather may have been the victim of a type of senior scam. And I remember a few years ago, I had some people who called me about a 100-year-old grandfather who had been scammed by a couple of people. They came to his door and they said, we're here to check your water. There may be a leak and there's a problem, and we're from the water department, so we'd like to go where your water is. Where his water meter at the time was in the basement, so they came down to look at it, and while he and the one individual were in the basement, the other person went in his bedroom, went through his drawers, and stole a considerable amount of cash. Now this, I'm not sure what we would call this, but it's obviously a diversion type crime where one goes with the person and the other one follows him around. And we'll talk a little bit about that type of crime. And then another type of crime involves elderly seniors, not that they're not all into kind of an elderly situation, but this person I happen to know. I won't say her name, but she was a big supporter of mine for a good 20 years, and she served on an important city commission. And her commission allowed her to be in the forefront of things. But what happened to her is very tragic. She developed a little bit of dementia, not a lot of dementia, but a certain amount of dementia. And it allowed a person, in this case an attorney, to approach her and become friendly with her and end up making romantic gestures toward her to the point where he convinced her that he was her boyfriend, which obviously she was married. That was not the case. And without her family knowing, she would take out $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 at a time, and she and her husband had saved up over $1 million, and within a year or so, he had drained her of every penny, and the only money that was left for the family was about $100,000 with the home. Now, the tragic situation is this, that her husband didn't know about it because he'd also developed dementia, and her children, she and her husband kept everything away from the children, and she has a son who has a serious illness, and he could have used that money, and instead it was all drained. So he ended up having to take care of his parents himself because he couldn't afford a nursing home, and it became a very tragic situation. But here was a good, trusting woman who allowed this scammer. He would say, I need money for a back surgery, my daughter's financially in trouble, and he'd use the same deal over and over again, and because she had dementia, she wasn't able to realize that, and she would take all this money out, all of this out in cash. So the family lost over $1 million. They couldn't afford to take care of their mother and father, and they ended up having to probably put them on assistance. That, to me, is terrible. I know of some other cases where I've had seniors call me up, mostly, if not always, in their 80s, and they've said, well, I got a call from somebody, and they said that I won $100,000 in some kind of lottery that they hadn't even entered, and if I want to get the $100,000 check, I have to send them $3,000 to pay for the cost of the taxes or what have you, and they did that. Or I had one man say that somebody called me up and said, my grandson was in jail and somewhere in Africa, and if I didn't send the money to pay to get him out of jail, he'd be tortured, maybe killed. So he wired $8,000. So in many cases, seniors wire money and then later realize it's too late. So these are some of the things we want to talk about. The people who come to your door, like the case of the 100-year-old man, and then distract him while they go through his bedroom and steal money or jewelry, or the case where someone is romanticized, or the case where they offer a deal that people can't give up. They've won money and they just need to pay money to get the money. So we'll go through that. Now I'd like to ask Sergeant Nichols some questions. Mr. Nichols, is it accurate to state that the typical victim of a senior scam tends to be around 80 or older, and that he or she lives alone and has cash in his or her home?
That's more than fair. That's actually the typical victim description that we have, for any number of reasons, that as you age, you become more and more attractive to this particular criminal element. There was an article published in December of 2012 in the Detroit Free Press that said there's actually evidence, scientific proof, that there are physical changes in the brain as people age that become
more trusting, I would assume.
Well, you become less able to distinguish between suspicious behavior these scams that play on your emotions and rather than logical thought processes make you more vulnerable or prone to these crimes.
And because a very common thing is, I get calls from seniors who say they have some grandchild or granddaughter or grandson, whoever, and they're in trouble and they need money. Is this a common thing?
That's very common, and all of these types of scams play on people's emotions. And what they do is they try and get you into a different area where you're not thinking clearly and rationally, where you're now involved emotionally in trying to help this relative or close friend or family member to prevent some kind of harm or damage that may come to them.
All right, what about the diversion or distraction scam? How common is that, and how would you explain that? I know we're going to show a video of that. Do you want to explain that briefly?
What's unique about this particular scam is that it happens in the person's home, and the victim is home minding their own business when they receive a knock on the door, the doorbell rings, and once they answer the door, there's a representation that the individual on the porch or at the door is from a utility company or some department within the city government, whether it's the water department or DPW, and there's some inspection that needs to be done. And whether it's electrical, whether it's water, whether it's running utility lines behind the house, there's always some presentation of an improvement that's going to be done that's going to make sure the senior is safe and it's going to save the senior money. Once you couple those three things together, when you have senior citizens on fixed incomes, everybody wants to save money. So once you start developing that storyline that the senior is more likely to give in and either come out of the home, so the scam artist can divert them into the yard or a neighbor's yard.
While another individual is going through their house.
That's exactly right. Or in the wintertime, they don't necessarily abandon a particular crime. They just change it up a little bit where now they need to be invited in. So they're checking the electricity within the house or checking the water pipes within the house, something where they can get someone to open the door.
Such as the case of the 100-year-old
That's
man.
Exactly right.
I understand that scammers are either gypsies or criminal travelers. How do these people become scam artists?
When you talk about the gypsy lifestyle and the individuals that are brought up within this culture, the individuals that travel around the country, particularly preying on the elderly community, they're taught from the moment they can walk and talk to lie and cheat and steal, and they're professional actors. So when you talk about the con man, the traditional con man, from the moment these children are able to walk and talk, they're taught the script, they're taught where to go, how to stand, what to say, how to divert individuals to open up the opportunity for criminal activity. So you're talking generation after generation.
So in a way you could say, I've heard the phrase, there's no honor amongst thieves, but there's clearly no honor whatsoever amongst gypsies, right?
Absolutely not. The people that live that transient lifestyle live on the victimization of others. And they don't have what we would consider the traditional job. They don't have any ties to the community. They don't have any responsibilities towards education or employment, taxes, credit, nothing that we would consider.
So they're kind of like grifters, right?
Yeah, that's where you get the general gypsy term, is that it's a transient itinerant lifestyle where they'll go typically where there's a population that they can victimize.
And they tend to be, I would assume, warm weather oriented, so maybe they come to Michigan in the north and maybe they're doing the south or the western states or wherever it's warm? Is it not a crime that tends to be weather-oriented a little bit?
When you get into the home improvement type scams, that's very true. However, where we find people getting into trouble is if you start to differentiate between the seasons and saying, well, this type of crime doesn't happen in January.
They're still going to come about water bills or
They'll have a
something.
different scam. So the weather itself doesn't necessarily dictate the type of crime that they're going to have.
Now, follow up to what you said. You said they train their children. Would this mean that some of the scammers could even be minors or not?
Oh yes, in very common garage sales, for example, when someone needs to use a restroom, who doesn't go to the garage sale with their little Johnny, and little Johnny now has to use the restroom. Oh,
little
they play
Johnny
their
then will
sympathies.
steal. while he's
Right,
in-
and little Johnny's supposedly in the restroom when in reality he's in the bedroom taking everything that's of value.
How often does that happen?
It's really hard to tell because for any number of reasons we don't know how many crimes are reported. So we know it happens quite frequently, and as we've seen in the video that was shown, more and more security systems are being placed into elderly residents' homes by family members.
And so don't be fooled by the age of the person coming to your door.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Young people are just as susceptible to being gypsies as older people.
Absolutely.
All right, do scams ever become violent?
When people think of the traditional violence and the approach that people would have with violence, when you watch the news, you see the robberies, the carjackings, the shootings. Those aren't the typical violent acts that we would see with these types of criminals. They don't come to your home armed with a gun. They don't kick in your door with ski masks on in the middle of the night. These are people that are smooth-talking criminals. However, that being said, if they're inside your home and they're cornered, they feel that they're identifiable, that their con has been exposed, and they're trapped, then yes, there have been instances where these criminals have exhibited violence. They've pushed elderly residents down. They've assaulted them. They've tied them up. They've done things to ensure that they can get away.
So it's like cornering a rat. If you corner a rat, it'll attack.
Exactly. They don't go into your home expecting to have a confrontation. However, if there's a possibility that they'll get caught, then they'll do whatever they need to do to get away.
What's involved in an investigation of a senior scam? What's involved in that?
The hardest part is the identification of the suspect. So you first interview the victim, and ideally it would be immediately after the crime took place, because as time goes on, the memory of the incident tends to deteriorate very quickly with an elderly victim. So keeping them on task and making sure that this is more than likely an isolated incident, because there is a sense of fear associated with that, and elderly residents are typically the original owners of their home. So there's a sense of violation there, and cooperation with law enforcement typically isn't that freely given.
And I've often thought that older people are more trusting in general, especially if you look back on the World War II generation. They grew up to be trusting, and so they're in a world where you shouldn't be as trusting, and as they get older, they're still tend to be more trusting, right?
Absolutely. And I remember my grandmother telling me a story that when she grew up, even when my mom grew up, that they would sleep with the front door wide open, and they would never lock their doors. They would always trust the neighbors to bring in their mail, or watch after the house when they're on vacation. And now everything's locked down with deadbolts and rails and bars and bolts.
And that is true. My parents told me the same thing. They lived in Detroit, and my mother told me they would leave money out for the paper boy and things like that. That's a long gone, bygone era. What if a case goes to court, which I'm sure you'll respond to this. It's rare that it does go to court because these people are grifters, they're gypsies, they're traveling around, they don't stay, so it's hard to really apprehend them. But if you're lucky and it goes to court, what is the punishment? And are judges in Warren hard on scammers?
As an overall generalization, the approach of the criminal justice system towards these people is pretty lenient because it's seen as a monetary crime. It's seen as someone lost some money, and the number one attempt that these criminals make when they are identified and caught is restitution. So if they can make full restitution, the likelihood of going to jail or prison is greatly diminished. So they can get some sort of probation if they plead guilty, or some kind of fine.
So maybe we need to have a stronger communication with the judges on minimum mandatory sentences?
Yeah, better communication is always better with everyone within the criminal justice system.
Is there, well, I was going to ask, is there one judge that maybe is harder, or is it just a general rule all judges tend to if there's restitution made, they say no.
Well, I think the scope of the problem, I've been teaching this around the country for a number of years, and it's just the general impression and the understanding of not knowing the scope of what you're dealing with. And when you look at the criminal element, how far-reaching the criminal enterprise really is, and it's organized crime in its truest sense. So when you talk about the individuals that specifically focus on this crime and target the elderly people, there is a hierarchy, and the money does flow up and the power does flow down. So when you look at the scope of the problem as of the big picture, that really speaks volumes to what we're dealing with. And generally across the country, we're no different than anywhere else, that the perception is it's an isolated incident with a particular individual, when in reality it's a larger part of an organization.
It's a very insidious thing, because it's something goes in our society and affects the most trusting and weakest of us all, the very old, right?
That's
and so
absolutely right.
everybody at some point is going to be a victim of a senior scam. If you live long enough, you're going to be a victim. And even if you're not a victim, one of your neighbors or your parents or your grandparents are going to be a victim. So it's a scam that affects all of us. It's a crime that could affect each and every one of us if we live long enough.
Absolutely.
And what is a bunco artist?
Bunco is just an old term that goes back in the criminal justice system, refers to money, fraud, scams, those types of criminal acts. The home improvement scam in particular, now that we're entering into warm weather, is people come to Warren and they'll knock on someone's door, cold call, and say, hey, I was doing a job down the road, typically where there's some construction being done, whether it's roofing, siding, painting, road work.
And I just happen to have some
And
extra.
I have some leftover material. I'll give you a super one-time deal, but you have to act right now. You know, last chance, last bucket of paint, last load of asphalt or whatever they might be hawking at the time, and they'll con the person and into agreeing to some sort of home improvement, which then results in some ridiculously poor workmanship with material that isn't even legitimate. It's probably not even paint if they represent themselves as painters. I've seen all kinds of things from watered down paint to used motor oil on driveways.
So the bottom line is, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true.
That's the best advice. And General Douglas MacArthur said there's no security in this world, there's only opportunity. Well, I say if you remove the opportunity, then you have security.
All right, here's some warning signs of home improvement scams. Number one, the repair person drives an unmarked truck or van with an out-of-state license. The worker has no business identification, local addresses, or telephone number. You are offered a special price if you sign today, which is what you just said. The worker wants upfront cost or fee or accepts only cash. No written estimates or contracts are provided. The worker does not have any references. The offer sounds, as I said, too good to be true. The worker cannot provide any contractor's license, permits, insurance, or bonding information. I think one of the key things to wonder about is they insist on giving you money. They insist you give them money up front.
Very common.
They don't want checks. I'm sure they don't want checks
Right.
or anything like that. What should a senior do if he suspects he or she is a target for a home improvement scam? I had a senior call me, I believe it was last week, and she said it was a videotape call saying that you need to get a hold of us at such and such number because there's a possibility that your ID is not correct or something, and you need to call us and give us this information. And she called me up, and I said, don't call it back. I said, no one's going to ask you for any ID on the phone. But sometimes seniors recognize that, sometimes they do it. What's your response to that?
My response to phone solicitations or mail solicitations are don't even acknowledge that they're there. You wouldn't, hold the door for someone who just stole your purse. So why do you continue to stay on the phone and engage someone in a conversation that wants to steal your money remotely? Those are really the easy ones. You just prevent it. You don't, respond to the mail or continue.
So
on
the best thing to do is if somebody calls you up and wants personal information about you, hang up.
Absolutely, immediately.
So, in doubt, hang up.
Yes, the more concerning ones are the personal face-to-face solicitations when someone's at your front door. And I hear it from senior citizens all the time. I've done a number of senior citizen presentations that, we don't want to be a bother to the police department. We don't want to concern you with this nonsense. It's just, a little old lady, that's concerned for her safety. Well, I've been very fortunate to work for a police department that has been very, very supported by the administration. And with Commissioner Green and Deputy Commissioner Glasso and your support, the Warren Police Department has become a very well-known place around the country in law enforcement for targeting these individuals and identifying them and being preventive and proactive. So we would much rather have someone call to say, there's someone on my porch, and we will send a policeman. We will send someone out there to identify who this person is and find out what they're there for. And if the person's legitimate and they have ID and they're there for a legitimate purpose, then there's no harm at all. The problem we have is the one time that no one calls and we find out that's a victim. We would much rather respond 100 times to someone's home and find out that it's just an
You'd
innocent
rather
mistake.
prevent it than try to patch
Absolutely,
it up.
because the
Patching up is difficult, right?
of course, now you got to try and pick up pieces.
What areas of the city do senior scammers go to? Is there a particular area they go to or not?
Absolutely not. And what they do is they target individual residences, and they don't go to particular areas of the city or the area.
They target everybody.
They will target everywhere. They'll go Detroit, Hamtramck, Madison Heights, Warren, Sterling Heights. It doesn't matter.
Would they more likely go to affluent areas of the city or to areas where there's a lot of seniors? Of course, they may not know where the areas are where there are a lot of seniors, but.
This question comes up particularly in law enforcement classes that I do, and how do they identify their victims? They will drive down the street and any one of us can say where the elderly residents of our community live. Who has the metal garbage cans? Who has the single nylon web?
So metal garbage cans is kind of
It's one of the indicators, and you put a bunch of those together. Drapes and curtains in the picture window, a single lamp in the picture window, drapes and curtains, the nylon web folding chair, the handicap, anything with a physical assist rail on the front of the home, vehicles with handicap license plates. If you take each individual item like that by itself doesn't mean much. But when you look at the big picture with the big, large, mature landscaping, that is the perfect target home.
Okay.
So they don't look for a particular area because they don't want to stand out.
They look for signs of elderly people.
Yes, yes.
What about the romantic scam artists? How do they work?
This is, I wouldn't say typical, but it's not uncommon. Because as we age, a number of things happen. Our spouses will pass away. Sometimes our children pass away.
Yeah.
So if you outlive some of your family members, you become lonely and isolated. And once you become lonely and isolated, all you want to do is have a friend. And if you can find someone who will listen to you and believe in what you have to say and become friendly, it's very easy for these people to move in emotionally and take control of someone's life. So once that happens, and this takes place over a period of time. So this isn't something that someone would come to your door and all of a sudden you're out a bunch of money. So once these things start to happen, it's emotional control. And once you have emotional control, now you become a friend, now you become a romantic interest, now you can dictate where they go, which doctor's appointments they make, which medication you take, and you can start manipulating those types of things and further the criminal activity and getting their money. There have been a number of reported incidents where the elderly victim does get married, and what happens then is once you're legitimately married, that you're entitled to all the spousal rights and privileges that any other married couple would have. So now not only do you have access to the things that the victim gives you, but now you can go and take it. You can mortgage the home, you can pull an equity line, you can get credit cards, car loans, take the car, take the pension,
Wasn't there a
life
case
insurance.
that you told me recently? Can you go over that, which was in this, I think, the Mound Road 10-mile area or 11, where the elderly man did marry this younger woman, and she took advantage of him, and he needed pills to stay alive, and she even cut those back, changed them, or what have you. Can you go over that just briefly?
What we see with elderly victims is, like everyone else, we're creatures of habit. And as we age, we become entrenched in our routines. So you want to be the first one at the bank on Mondays and Thursdays. You want to go to the same grocery store at 11:30 on Wednesdays
So they
and
spot
Fridays.
all this.
And there's a routine or a pattern that these scammers will identify. And you just happen to bump into someone at a grocery store where it's a common place where the victim goes all the time, and let's lets their guard down. Strike up a friendly conversation, nothing much, nothing that would raise an eyebrow, and then wait for the next time. And you strike up a conversation. Then after 2 or 3 or 4 times, it's a pattern of behavior that you can then strike up a friendship. Then it's, oh, where's your wife? I never see your wife here with you. Oh, she died a long time ago. Then now you have an in. And well, I can cook for you. I can wash your clothes. I can do your lawn, cut your lawn. I can.
And before you know it, they've conned them into getting married.
Exactly. Now I have an illness. I have a sick child. I have a relative I have to see. Can I borrow your car? I need some money. And then if they become romantically involved or there's some love interest that develops, now you can marry the person and you're entitled to all of the money.
And in this case, it was a tragic ending for the
It
senior.
was, absolutely. The person
right.
actually tapped into the bank account and the pension and life insurance and took the gentleman's car and left. So it was,
He was left without any money at all,
nothing.
and he had plenty of money. All right, should a senior try to get the license plate of a scammer?
I would not encourage any victim to chase any suspect at any time and put yourself in danger. However, any piece of information that could aid in the investigation sometimes is invaluable. So if you are able to obtain a piece of information like a license plate without running out of the house, without putting yourself in harm's way behind a vehicle, then by all means write it down on a napkin
Any
or something.
information you can get will be
But by no means run out of the house and let these individuals know that you suspect their activity and you're going to report it to the police. I would not recommend anyone put themselves in
Isn't
harm's
one of
way.
the prevention rules, be careful about sharing your personal information? Shouldn't that go across the board? People, but seniors in general should never ever share any personal information.
Absolutely. Yeah, no name, no address, social security number, obviously, bank account
Somebody
information.
comes up to you and is friendly, you got to ask yourself, why is this person being friendly to me? right?
Exactly. And one of the biggest ones, particularly for elderly residents, is never let anyone know you live alone. If you live alone, that's a big red flag that just identifies you as a perfect victim.
I've heard that seniors are sometimes targeted for funeral and burial scams. I mean, the newspaper all the time lists the burial and all that, and if they say they're survived by a spouse, does that put that spouse in that home at risk?
It can. We don't see it all that often. Typically, those types of things, once there's a death in the family, there's a pretty sure thing that the house is going to be vacant for a day or 2 or 3 for
Somebody to
funeral
break in.
activities.
Yeah.
So, you can always call the Warren Police Department. We'll put you in the diary, you call it the diary, and we'll make sure a patrol car drives by your house several times throughout the shift to make sure that everything's okay.
How prevalent are mail scams? Are they very prevalent or not?
I get them all the time at home. They're very common. You've won a lottery, you've won some sort of prize, you've been entered into some drawing, but you have to send some sort of money to claim your prize. If you win something, you don't have to pay to claim your prize. If you win, you win. So a lot of those things are just the classic junk mail, and it should be destroyed and shredded, just like every other piece of junk mail that you get.
Would you agree and would you react to these statements? Older Americans are less likely to report a fraud because they don't know who to report it to, or are too ashamed of having been scammed, or don't know that they have been scammed. Especially elderly victims may be living by themselves. They want to remain independent. They're scammed, and they decide, I don't want to tell my children that I've been scammed because they may tell me now it's time to go to assisted living and I want to live in my home.
Absolutely, and that plays into the home security systems and video cameras being placed into homes that we're seeing more and more of, because there's a perception of not being able to care for yourself, a perception of losing control, a perception of being too trusting. So when you have those types of perceptions become reality sometimes. And elderly victims, you can't force a victim to be a victim. So elderly victims quite commonly will refuse to even cooperate or say that they've been a victim.
Is there a problem of elderly victims reporting crimes and getting them prosecuted? For example, when an elderly victim does report the crime, they often make poor witnesses. You've kind of alluded to the effects of age on money. They are counting on elderly victims not being able to supply enough details to the investigators. In addition, the victim's realization that they have been swindled may take weeks or more likely months. And sometimes they don't even know they've been swindled, right?
That's correct, especially when the individuals come to your home for the home improvement scams or the diversion burglaries from the water department or some other agency. If they will target an area of the home where there's some valuables, there's a likelihood that it won't be discovered for a long time. So if it is discovered, as we age, we accept the fact that certain things happen. It's not uncommon to have elderly residents blame themselves for misplaced items, when in fact they've actually become a victim. So putting it together 2 and 3 and 4 months later is very, very difficult.
All right, I'd like to thank Sergeant Matt Nichols for being here today, but before he leaves, can you give us just off the top some key things that are strong suggestions that seniors can do to protect themselves against senior scams, and that families of seniors can perhaps share with their elderly parents or their grandparents what they should or should not do?
The number one thing that I always say is don't blame yourself. If something like this happens, notify someone, whether it's a family member, you call the police department, we'll come out and talk to you. You've instituted a wonderful program where we're going to have a detective specifically assigned to handle senior frauds and scams within the Detective Bureau. So we're not afraid to come out and talk to you. We're not embarrassed to come out and talk to you. That's our job, and we will absolutely come out and talk to you. There's no shame in being a victim. That's number one. You have to let somebody know before we can help you. Don't ever let anyone know that you live alone. As we age, more and more of us live alone. Always keep your doors locked. That seems like a no-brainer, but a lot of people will close and lock the entry door, but not the screen door or the storm door. If someone approaches you with any kind of scam or story or ruse, always ask yourself why. Why does this person care that my shingles are deteriorating? Why does this person care if I'm lonely or I'm in the grocery store by myself? Always ask yourself why, and never let anyone take emotional control over you. And if there's any doubt at all, I've heard the advice, try and verify identification if someone comes to your door, says they're from DTE Energy. Don't try and verify identification. Don't try and verify their story. Don't get into a discussion with them or a debate. Call 911. If someone's at your door trying to get in your home or trying to get you out of your home, call 911. That's an emergency. We will send a police officer to your door to make sure that you're safe. Those are the basic, bare bones, rules of advice that I could give.
All right, I'd like to thank Sergeant Matt Nichols of the Administrative Services Bureau for being with us today. And the bottom line, I would say that if it sounds like it's too good to be true, then it's too good to be true, and don't allow yourself to become a victim from something that's too good to be true. Thank you, Sergeant Nichols, for coming today, and I want to commend you and the Warren Police Department for helping to keep Warren safe and helping to prevent our seniors from becoming victims of senior scams.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And again, this is Jim Fouts. Thank you for being part of another Fouts Forum on senior scams.